So good morning or good afternoon, depending on where you're located, and welcome to our fourth annual Energy Storage Conference Virtual Edition Lessons Learned and Storage panel. We thank you for joining us today. All attendees will be muted throughout the duration of this event. If you have any questions, we ask that you please submit them by clicking on the chat icon on the right side of your screen and typing in and submitting your question. Questions will be addressed by our panelists. And with that, at this time, it is my pleasure to introduce our moderator, Eli Hinckley, a partner at K&L Gates out of our Washington, D.C. office. Eli, please begin.
Thanks, Grant. For those of you who are on who have attended our event before, we've done this lessons learned panel before, but usually in the context of people actually trying to get projects move forward and things like that. And it's always been very interesting, but this year, we've come at this a little differently, and I think it's a great opportunity to really rethink our approach to some of the questions around risk allocation and things like that, which continue to be challenging when we try to put these projects together. And so we've got a group of people that have been working on a controversy related to a storage project, and they're going to take us through the actual process of the controversy, what happened, how it broke down, and really think about sort of how the risk piece played out through that controversy. So, like I said, for me, this is, I think, going to be a fascinating conversation. I'm looking forward to it myself, and I'll try to stay mostly out of the way. So, Grant, if you'd move us to our next slide, I will introduce the panel that will be taking us through this. So, from our team at K&L Gates, we have John Rothermick, who's a partner in our Portland office. John has more than 20 years of litigation experience representing clients in a broad range of commercial issues, both in state and federal courts and arbitration across the country. Really good at what he does, and has spent a lot of time in the world of energy storage now, and has some great perspective on that. Dan Souter is a principal and co-founder of SoundGrid Partners based in Seattle, Washington. Dan has over a decade of experience leading energy storage projects, including experience at the electric utility Duke Energy, ESS software startup One Energy Systems, EPC firm Doosan Grid Tech, and is now supporting utility and developer clients on energy storage projects across the U.S. His partner, also principal, Tess Williams, and also co-founder of Grid Sound Partners, leads the analytic and design services, helping electric utilities and other megawatt-scale power producers evaluate, procure, integrate, and optimize energy storage and other distributed energy resources. Prior to SoundGrid, she led the analytics team at Doosan Grid Tech and was at the Pacific Northwest National Laboratory. So we get some very technical support to think about how some of the breakdown and things like where warranties begin and end, and who's responsible for operations lives in these projects when actually put to the test in the controversy. So with that, I'm going to hand over to John, who's going to take us through the agenda, a little bit of background, and really get the conversation started.
Thanks, Eli. Grant, next slide. Good morning, everybody. As Eli mentioned so kindly, I'm John Rothermick. I'm a partner in K&L Gates' Portland, Oregon office, and was involved in this arbitration regarding battery storage contracting and deployment. Our agenda here for today, what we're planning to cover in the next hour is we'll just talk about the background of our case a little bit, but it was about just sort of high level. And then, because we have a pretty broad range of registrants for this panel, Dan and Tess are going to go over a little bit key energy storage system concepts and key energy storage system contract roles and issues, just to make sure that everybody's on the same page and we're all kind of following the discussion equally. And then we'll actually proceed to really 4 characteristics of the energy storage system contracting process that we learned lessons about in our arbitration. And we've kind of divided those up into defining risks and responsibilities, defining risk in those ESS contracts. This is a supply contract we're talking about here. What are the risks and how do we make sure that they're actually called out in the agreement? And then how do you allocate those risks? How do you phrase the warranties, the force majeure clauses, the liquidated damages provisions, and how do they interact? Once you've actually got a good agreement and agreed risk-sharing mechanisms, how do you monitor performance to ensure that the system is actually functioning according to the agreement? And then how do you assess and enforce remedies if performance falls below contractual obligations? With that, I think, Grant, we can stop the screen sharing for now, and I will just talk a little bit about the background of our arbitration. So as I mentioned, our case involved an energy storage supply contract, and it was for a battery storage facility to be designed, and it was a contract between a battery supplier and a purchaser for a system that was to be deployed in the PJM market. The contracts were from 2014, the original contracts, and the system was deployed in 2015. And as many people on this call probably know, at that time, this was fairly new technology. It was a new market, this Regulation D market. And there was a fair amount of uncertainty as to how these projects were going to work and what the requirements were going to be. I mean, PJM had sort of set out some signals. There had been an existing signal, but it was just a new space. As many people on this call probably also know, at the beginning of 2016, PJM, the regional transmission organization that regulates that Midwestern grid, they changed this Regulation D frequency regulation market signal. It had been originally conceived as being more battery friendly in terms of its energy neutrality requirements. And due to sort of market demands, PJM changed the signal in a way that damaged battery resources, damaged these storage plants that had been deployed for that Regulation D frequency regulation market. That the change signal effectively it eliminated or changed the energy neutrality requirements in ways that caused the batteries to operate more frequently in sort of fully charged and fully discharged states. And it also effectively almost doubled the throughput on these battery resources, meaning the amount that the batteries were actually cycling, the amount of discharging and charging they were doing basically doubled, which of course means that the parties' expectations when they designed the specifications for these systems, the signal they were going to be working with changed. The performance specs no longer matched the use case, and of course, these increased throughput demands led to most likely to increased battery degradation, which of course is a major issue with these contracts and these kinds of projects. So the issue in the case was really about whose responsibility, who accepted this risk, who bore the risk of this signal change in the way that it harmed the performance and the longevity of these energy storage systems. At first blush, the issue seemed to be, was this regulatory change a force majeure event as defined by the force majeure provision in the contract, which was sort of a broad force majeure provision that was not totally exclusive. But as we dug deeper into the case and as we enlisted Dan and Tessa's help from SoundGrid, the case really became about what did the parties agree that these facilities would be able to do? What requirements were they supposed to be able to meet? Was it a particular Reg D signal? Was it any Reg D signal? Did they agree that these projects could even be used in different kinds of storage markets and still perform to the contract performance standards and warranties. So, in these early contracts from 2014, we found a lot of ambiguities around all these issues, and that's what we're going to talk about today, is to sort of take some of the risks that were poorly defined that ended up in sort of a big legal battle in our case, and talk about best practices now to better define those risks, better allocate those risks, and eliminate a lot of uncertainty, not only in the face of something as dramatic as that Reg D signal change, but in other kinds of shifting expectations and how you can make sure you've accounted for future contingencies. And with that, I will turn it over to Dan and Tess to give us a little background about key storage concepts and key contract elements in these kinds of contracts.
Great. Thank you, John. Grant, would you please present the key energy storage concept slide? Great. Thanks for the opportunity to talk with you all day. I'm going to get started on the slide, and then Tess will fill it in, and we'll then proceed quickly into the details of the controversy. Would you please go to the key ESS? There you go. Perfect. Great. So much of this is probably clear to a lot of folks on the call, but we have a pretty broad audience. So I wanted to get clear on some key concepts so the rest of this makes sense. The first one, it really arises due to the fact that energy storage systems are a very complex integration of a lot of different technologies. Certainly there's the battery. There's also the power conversion system or the inverter, the HVAC systems, fire suppression systems, and other things. So highly integrated set of diverse technologies that comprise an energy storage system. Two of the key specifications that we'll talk about today are the power rating. And so that's the maximum power in megawatts that an energy storage system can discharge or charge. And that's generally expected to remain constant through the life of a project. The second one is the energy capacity. And so that's how many megawatt hours or units of energy an energy storage system can store. And that charges it up, stores that energy, and then can discharge it later. For this spec, unlike the power specification, that one's expected to degrade over the course of the project, primarily due to usage, but also due to time. So the energy capacity in megawatt hours at the beginning of the project will slowly decline or degrade and get smaller and smaller as the energy storage system is used over time. And so that's a key principle here in this. And as you can imagine, under different PJM Reg D signals, that the rate of that degradation changes significantly. Okay, in the middle bullet there, that control signal is really what determines it's the primary cause of the energy capacity degradation. And so if you're using a battery very gently, if it's getting shallow cycles and low depth of discharge and a small number for energy throughput or the kilowatt hours that go through the system, it'll degrade a lot slower than if it's being pushed to its outer state of charge limits from the top to the bottom many times a day at a fast rate. That will increase the speed at which the energy capacity degrades. And in the Reg D market in PJM, that's a signal issued by PJM. And so an asset that is following that signal, it's not the asset owner that controls that, but rather the market, the PJM Reg D market system does that. And so that's the signal that the energy storage system in our case was receiving. And so this is largely about how the parties respond to the changes of that signal and what it did to the battery. And finally, the last point goes back to this diverse integrated system. There are numerous aspects of an energy storage system which are designed to meet a certain usage. It's certainly the battery size, how many batteries you install so that they can degrade and still stay above their guaranteed energy capacity. But it's other things as well, like HVAC. A high rate of usage will add more heat into an energy storage system container, and therefore a larger HVAC system needs to be designed to remove that heat in order to keep the batteries at a good operating temperature. The conductor sizing, the way batteries are strung together in series and parallel. Various design aspects are based upon the usage, and so this sort of helps understand why defining a clear usage for an energy storage system or a clear application is critically important, not just for battery sizing, but many other aspects of the system. So those are just a couple of basics that make the rest of this make more sense. Tess, would you add anything, or anybody else?
I think you covered them all really well. I just maybe do a little foreshadowing. That rate of energy capacity degradation is a curve that can be calculated ahead of time that battery manufacturers know how to calculate. And that curve of expected degradation is a core part of all battery contracts. And one of the key things that we're going to be talking about over the rest of this hour is how the expected rate of degradation depends on usage, like Dan just said. And so if you have a rate of degradation in your contract that depends on a particular expectation of usage, then you need to get that expectation of usage in your contract as well, so that it's clear that there's that coupling between the two. And I think with that, we can move on.
Great, over to you, John.
Thanks, Dan. So, one last slide here. This is what we're going to, this is the way we've kind of tried to divide up this conversation in a sensible way to get a grip on the best way to deal with some of the issues that we encountered in our case. And so we're going to talk about definition, who's responsible, defining risk and obligation, who does what in the contract, and the specification piece. It is difficult in these battery storage contracts because, as Dan and Tess mentioned, these are complex systems. And there are a lot of different ways to contractually define what the system is supposed to do. And I think we've got some good ideas about the best way to do that, and issued things that you really should avoid or watch out for. The second piece is how to allocate those risks, and what if the system doesn't measure up on the one hand, or to expectations, or if the use case changes, or if other unexpected aspects of the use or the cycling or the signal or the battery environment change. Hopefully the contract makes it clear how those risks are allocated. And then we'll spend a little less time talking about how to, once you've defined those things in the contract, you make sure the contract provides for equal access for both parties, the seller and the purchaser, to monitor the performance of the system, to monitor the use of the system, to calculate liquidated damages. And that's part of the assessment piece too, is as you have access to the data, is it performing? And do you need to enforce your obligations contractually, and how are you going to do that? So I think, Grant, we can go ahead and stop sharing the slides for a little bit and just talk. So in terms of defining key risks, we'll talk about the definition piece. And in our case, we really had two big issues, I think, around defining performance obligations. And the first of those issues was the fact that this contract from 2014 really mixed up sort of straightforward technical specifications measured in, nameplate specs, which are the energy and power requirements, sort of how much can this battery plant, how much is this battery plant supposed to discharge or charge at its maximum capacity, and what is the energy storage capacity of the battery, and how long should that storage capacity last for the duration of the warranty. So we had nameplate specs, power over energy, but we also had in this contract, you had the contract sort of define the nameplate specifications, but it also incorporated a separate 30-page appendix of technical specifications. Maybe it was a 50-page appendix. I don't remember. Maybe Dan and Tess do. But of technical specifications for this system that incorporated sort of like temperature operating ranges and a lot of other sort of operating parameters that may not have anything to do with whether or not the system was going to satisfy those nameplate specs or the warranty degradation. And so the question is the supplier not only obligated to satisfy the nameplate specs, but also, you know, these 30 pages of other technical specifications about how the system is supposed to be designed or operate. The other issue there in terms of defining those specifications is that it was a little unclear whether the agreement was that this system was designed to operate under the nameplate specs, or was it designed to simply provide frequency regulation service in that Reg D PJM market? Because the contract also, in those 30 pages, made many, many references to the Reg D market and the PJM signal. From one perspective, you could say this system works great so long as it's responding to the signal well. On the other hand, you could say, well, the signal is not the important part. It's really those nameplate specs and under any signal or under potentially different uses. And with that in mind, I'll turn it back to Dan to talk about how those things could have been done better and how they're being done better now.
Yeah. Thanks, John. Yeah, so we've seen a lot. We've all seen energy storage system specifications evolve quite a bit over the years, and certainly since these 2014 contracts. Over that time, I think that there's two philosophies for specifications, and either of them work better in different cases. So one's not right or wrong. It's just a matter of the goals of the contract. Those two philosophies are having either an application-based specification where the goal is to perform a certain job or application versus a prescriptive specification that tells you the details of how the machine should work and the internal specs and characteristics of the machine itself, and making those requirements as opposed to performing a certain job. And so, as you can imagine, these can be very, very different ways of characterizing a performance of an ESS. In this case, the application spec would have said the energy storage system must successfully follow the PJM Reg D signal, and maybe that needs to be defined, like the signal needs to be defined a little bit, but that would be the technical requirement for the ESS. And now it is incumbent upon the ESS manufacturer and engineering groups, the provider of that system, to design it so that it can meet that, it can do that job. So that can be these specs can be more concise. So that's an application-based spec. The other way to do it is prescriptive, where you go through and you list out all the characteristics of the machine you want to have built. We want it to have this power. We want it to have this energy capacity. We want it to operate within these temperature ranges. It needs to be this color. It needs to have this size of conductor, and so on. There can be pages and pages of these things for an ESS specification, since so many things need to work together for a battery to work. So in this case, the contracts were a little bit muddled in this point. Some aspects of the contracts were clearly focused on PJM Reg D, and which made it feel a little bit like an application-based specification. But then there were also lists of specs describing the machine, and so that created a problem. That the fact that these two philosophies of specifications were mixed up. Because if the ESS is doing some of them, but not doing others, let's say it is complying with its prescriptive nameplate specs, but it's unable to follow the PJM Reg D signal, which is the application. So that makes it difficult to know if the supplier is meeting their obligations. Vice versa, let's say it's meeting the signal pretty well, making money in the market, doing a good job, even though it's not meeting all of its technical engineering specs. You know, the owner may not care because it's doing what it's supposed to do, but the contract has those in it. And so when we get into a dispute, that makes it very difficult to allocate whose fault it is. So that's sort of the two different spec paradigms that we see. And when we're helping clients put together good contracts, we try to focus on which one of those is the most important for the client's interest, for the owner's interest. Is it more important to specify the characteristics of the machine or talk about the job, and get really crisp and clear on what one or the other of those is, and stick to that, and make sure it's not muddled between them, which can create ambiguity and risk down the road.
Dan, when you're working with clients now, thinking about which direction to go, application versus prescriptive, what's driving their decision making?
Yeah, great question. So one of the key things is, so the client's objectives for the life of the project are important. So looking at the lifetime of it, 10 or 20 years, whatever it is. The first thing we think about is flexibility, and how clear is the outcome for that client. Do they have one objective in mind that's going to last over the whole life of this project? Let's say it's a 10-year project to be Reg D, and that's the only goal. In that case, an application spec is probably most appropriate. If the client is more thinking about, well, we want to start by doing this market, and then maybe we're going to switch and do something else. Maybe that market's going to get saturated and we want to be flexible. Maybe we're an electric utility and we're going to do asset upgrade deferral for a few years, and then we're going to work on energy arbitrage. If you want flexibility, then a prescriptive-based spec describes the tool, and then you can use that tool for a variety of different applications that could change. And so that flexibility nature is one of the key determinants of which spec paradigm is best.
Thank you.
I think as we've seen, Dan, we've talked about relating what Dan has just said back to our case. I think what we see is that sometimes less is more when it comes to these specs, in terms of boiling it down to what you really care about, in terms of what is going to drive the revenue. As long as you've got, as long as the battery is performing well in its intended purpose, and it is serving the grid the way it's supposed to serve the grid, or making money the way it's supposed to make money, then it's probably not important to have in your contract the temperature operating parameters. So long as you've well defined the degradation warranty and obligation, which we'll get into in a minute.
The car analogy, John, works well here, where we said, if you're buying a car, you can tell the manufacturer all the tire pressures and the spring tensions and the temperatures in the pistons, or you can just say, I need a car that can get my kids to school, and make sure it does that. And so that can be very crisp and concise and pretty clear. As long as that's well defined, that can be a much stronger spec than trying to throw every detail into the contract and creating a lot of ambiguity.
Which brings us, I think, to sort of the second overarching principle in terms of this defining risks of the ESS performance or failure to perform, and that is defining what, and this mixes a little bit with the specification issue, right? But it's defining in this contract, what is this storage facility, the storage plant system going to be used for? What is the use case? And the problem we saw in our contract is that the use case, the sides would argue as to how well the use case was defined in this contract, I think, because one party maybe, obviously with the Reg D signal risk, did we agree to provide a system that would perform under the old Reg D signal, or did we agree to provide a system that would perform under any Reg D frequency regulation signal? Or did we agree to provide a system that would function in any frequency regulation market anywhere, maybe not even PJM? And while, reasonable minds could differ as to how well that was defined in our contract, it was at least ambiguous enough to allow us to have a fight about it. And that is a fight that you would want to avoid if at all possible. So Dan, what is the best way to define those use cases in these written contracts?
Yeah, I'll just make a brief comment, and then Tess is well positioned to answer this one, which is just, first of all, just getting clear on the principles you want to define. And if in using this case in Reg D, first of all, the buyer getting clear on what are the eventual markets that we might want to use this for. Are we planning on using it in any frequency regulation market? One type of PJM, and what are the likelihoods of those things happening? And then that sort of tells you what you need to define. And now there are a lot of technical techniques to do that. And so, Tess, do you want to talk about some of those?
Yeah, for sure. I think the most important thing to keep in mind is that if you're going to do an application-based spec, which can be appropriate in a lot of ways, it needs to be clear, it needs to be measurable, and ideally, you want it to be exactly the things that are going to affect your revenue stream. So, for example, in the PJM Reg D market, you offer in a certain megawatt rating to the market, and then they dispatch your system as needed, and you get paid based on two characteristics, or sort of three. For a given hour, you get paid based on the megawatt that you offered in and was accepted, and your performance score, how well you followed that signal as you were dispatched by PJM. And then over a longer period of time, you're also getting revenue based on how many hours you're in the market. What's your uptime, your overall reliability of your system? And so I do think that you can, it can be a process to negotiate with a supplier. They are not going to, could be challenging for them to take on an obligation to that rests in any way on a third party, so it's not reasonable to say you have to be able to perform in the Reg D market when the Reg D market is subject to change. But you can do things like say, you have to be able to do a certain throughput per day. You have to be able to operate well with a certain average power level. You have to be able to operate with a certain accuracy. You have to be able to maintain a certain uptime over the course of the year. And those are all objective, measurable, crisp parameters that relate directly to the revenue that you're able to earn with the system. So I think those are the kinds of principles that you'd like to try to follow when defining an application-based spec.
And we actually have a related question from the audience, and that's they're seeing it difficult working with some of the OEMs to actually get that application-based coverage. And so are you having more success by virtue of your ability to help define these sort of manageable parameters as opposed to something that's more market focused, which does put that sort of third party, something else you can control into the mix?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, the best thing you can do in this phase is to be crisp and precise around what each party is talking about. So when one person says frequency regulation, they're thinking of a certain curve. When another person says that, they're thinking of a different curve. And so bringing that into objective parameters, as Tess said, and that generally involves modeling, doing some engineering analysis and putting in some crisp terms. That's very important. And that's the biggest thing that helps shrink this separation between OEMs and users. And a lot of times the market-based things like in PJM, the performance score, that's a fairly technical measure. So while it is something that a third-party market is administering, how it's administered is fairly straightforward and objective, and it becomes sort of an engineering process to define that. And the OEMs generally tend to like it when the buyer is defining things in the crispest possible technical terms as they can. That tells them what to design, and they're going to make thousands of design decisions on an ESS based on those specs that they have to design to. So it's much easier to have that crisp and clear as opposed to any ambiguity. It also results in a lower system cost since the OEM can put in less risk premium. If they know exactly what they need to do and they design the system to do it, they don't need to plan for what might happen if they come up short.
So to keep us kind of moving along, I wanted to mention one last sort of definitional, it's a little bit of a mix between defining a risk and allocating a risk, and that is force majeure clauses in these ESS contracts. And I'm interested to see what Dan and Tess have to say about force majeure, because in our case, though, in 2014, as we said, there was some ambiguity around, is this a prescriptive specification or is it an application-based spec? But did that signal change constitute a force majeure event? And I think, and in our case, the force majeure clause, I think non-lawyers are often surprised to see how non-standard force majeure clauses in contracts are, even within the same industry. It's not, a lot of lawyers do it differently, and up until the pandemic at least, although, people take them pretty seriously in construction contracts, but sometimes, the details of those clauses are not paid attention to, and they can be exclusive, they can be inclusive, they can be broad, and it's, I would hope that after this discussion, everybody now has their use case and performance specs clearly defined enough that the question of whether or not a signal change force majeure is, but I don't know, Dan, how are those force majeure clauses looking now?
Yeah, for, as a more of an engineering perspective, I've kind of glossed over dozens of force majeure clauses in contracts and thought, okay, that sounds about right, cool. I definitely look at them with a lot more scrutiny now after this experience. And first of all, I like to always think of them as a fallback. That's the last thing you want to be using in your contract. If everything's clearly specified, you shouldn't have to get there. Barring like the clear force majeure events like flooding and famine and that kind of stuff. And so I think in order to avoid getting to the force majeure clause, we should think about all the things that could happen that are not in our control as the party to the contract. And that includes the traditional pretty clear force majeure things. But it brings up the whole idea of what third party actions could affect us. Maybe it's not riots, but what if the market is changed by FERC? I don't think FERC is an act of God, but they do change big stuff that affects us, and neither party has control over that. And that's sort of in the spirit of force majeure. So what we're seeing now is for parties to think about what are those uncontrollable external impacts, and let's list them. Let's explicitly think ahead what we're going to do if those happen. If the market fundamentally changes, how do we define fundamental? Is it, adding another signal, or is it just modifying the current signal? Is energy neutrality the variable of choice there? That's the kind of thing that now we try to clearly define in order to avoid going to force majeure.
Yeah, from a litigator's perspective, it certainly seems better to be defining those kinds of requirements, energy neutrality, and the range in which the signal range in which the system is supposed to meet its performance specs. Clearly, in those parts of the contracts, not rely on that force majeure clause. And if you do it well, then you can have narrower, more specific force majeure clauses, probably. Anyway, so just moving on. Tess, did you have something you wanted to throw in about that?
No, I think maybe just one thing that I would hope, this whole experience in the PJ and Reg D market, where it was an early and very exciting and very hot market for a little while, and it led to some of the first sort of commercial energy storage projects at scale. It was very formative in the energy storage industry, and the way it all, I'm not going to say came crashing down, but the dramatic impact of that signal change hopefully has caused everybody to be very aware of the possibility. If you're doing energy storage systems for, to earn money in markets, you need to be aware that that is a possibility. Markets change and evolve over the years. There are a lot of changes expected in future years. And so it's good to get the possibility of future market changes that are very likely to occur over the lifetime of energy storage system. See how much of that you can get into the contract in terms of previewing possibilities and being ready for them.
right?
Yeah.
Instead of relying on force majeure.
Mhm.
Yeah, and we often think of market changes as maybe from a negative perspective, which is where force majeure kind of comes up, but they can be positive. Markets can change in a good way. It would be a shame if performance specs were overly prescriptive and they prevented an owner from using a system in an evolved market to make more money. So it kind of goes both ways. In fact, in this case, the whole relationship between the capacity, the power capacity of the system and the performance score is such that you could lower the bid-in capacity and get a higher performance score and make more revenue. And so, there's market changes and there's market activities that we don't want to overly constrain through our specifications. And hence the application path is good. And if you focus on that, it generally helps avoid needing to fall back to force majeure types of clauses.
Well, and talking about making money and defining those revenue streams in the contract, I think leads us nicely to sort of our next big topic, which is once we define what these systems are supposed to do and define those risks, how do we allocate them? And from our case, I think we saw two main contractual areas where this really plays out. And the first of those was the warranty. I mean, as we've talked about already, and as everybody on this call, I'm sure already knows, that degradation curve in defining, the required longevity and capacity, energy capacity of these batteries and how long they're going to last is critical. So if you're drafting a warranty, both to meet performance obligations, sort of a repair and replace performance obligation warranty, degradation warranty from the manufacturer. I think the problems we saw here were, I would say, were really three with the warranty. Is that from the degradation perspective, this contract, there was no clear requirement about how you figured out whether the batteries were degrading or not, or how that was going to be tested or measured. And Dan and Tess can talk a little bit more about the best way to do that now. I think also, the way the throughput limit on these batteries was defined was somewhat ambiguous. So again, if we've well defined the use case and well defined the technical parameters of the use case, as Dan and Tess have been talking about, with the help of an engineer, then hopefully things like the throughput limit, the cycles, you're guaranteeing that you will, the supplier's guaranteeing in the warranty will be less ambiguous, but it's something to watch out for. And the last point, I thought in our case, our case had both liquidated damages provisions when the system wasn't meeting its performance obligations on the part of the manufacturer, but it also had these repair and replace warranty obligations and a degradation warranty, and it was a little unclear as to how those remedies interacted. So I don't know, Tess, Dan, what are your thoughts about better ways to do warranties?
Go ahead.
Yeah, lots of thoughts. Tess, going to go first, or you want?
No, you go ahead.
Okay. Yeah. Well, I like to think of these types of provisions. What if things don't go like we want them to? Generally warranties, liquidated damages, that kind of stuff. We want that to be a cookbook. We want that to be a procedure that's pretty objective and clear, so that there's not a lot of bickering about what we're supposed to do, but more focused on what happened and what do we do about it. And so that's kind of the general standard we want to have in these things. And so for warranty, that means what exactly is being warranted and under what conditions is it being warranted. Those are the two key elements. It sounds fairly obvious and straightforward, but it can get pretty complicated, particularly since many ESS parameters are codependent on each other. So for example, the energy capacity, that an energy storage system can discharge depends on the power at which it's discharged or how fast the energy is leaving. So you can't really say an energy capacity number without also talking about a power number when you're talking about a guarantee. And so we want that to be a cookbook procedure with no ambiguity, both in terms of what's warranted, also the conditions. It might be warranted when it's installed correctly in a certain place with a certain temperature paradigm going on and certain uses. But if you change any of that, how does the warranty change? Is it completely, is there a cliff where the warranty just ends? Or is there an adjustment to the warranty? So for example, relaxing the energy capacity guarantee as throughput increases, for example. So those kind of conditions that the warranty is valid under need to be clearly defined. Yeah, so those are the two kind of principles I would think of. Make it cookbook and know what exactly is warranted and under what conditions they're warranted.
So that's a great framework, and I think I'm just going to add one point and make a really big deal out of emphasizing it. When you're talking about warranties and you are using the metric throughput, you have to specify whether you mean discharge only throughput or whether you mean bidirectional throughput, the sum of all charge and discharge. There is no standard in the industry. It is, I've heard people claim, oh, this is standard in this case, this is standard in the other case. There's so much ambiguity. And so if you only take one thing away from this talk, I hope you remember, do not use throughput, energy throughput as a metric without clearly specifying at all times under all circumstances which of those two you're talking about. Because that factor of 2 is hugely important. There was an attempt to put a warranty sort of cap or outside envelope here that was associated with a throughput, that the warranty was void if a certain throughput level over lifetime had been exceeded. And a communication error happened in the calculation of that cap. And it ended up being twice as high as intended due to the communication, miscommunication at some point in the chain between the signal definition and the design and then getting into the contract. And so if you mean to cap the throughput at a certain level and you accidentally cap it at twice that, all of a sudden that's not a very good warranty provision. So please be very cautious and always specify whether you're talking about bidirectional or discharge only.
In the case that you guys worked on, this was strictly an issue between the owner and the OEM. Is that right? But I'm seeing more often in the market, we have an EPC that's layered on that can have influence on sort of who and how that warranty is negotiated. You have new software applications from third parties that come into play. Curious to sort of get your perspective on how you manage that multi-party construct in this warranty context.
Yeah. My view is that the contract is between two defined parties, and anybody who's supporting them or subcontracted to them really don't have a voice in that contract as it literally is written. And so it's very important that the parties in the contract are comfortable and understand the commitments that they're making to one another. That being said, if you're an EPC and you're not a battery manufacturer and you're asked to provide energy capacity degradation curve, you certainly better be talking to your battery manufacturer. And so they're not necessarily going to be on the hook to the owner unless there's some, the contract specifically says that. But ideally, whoever has their hands closest to the technical matter should be the ones who come up with that, and that contractual chain needs to work. So the EPC, if they make an energy capacity curve guarantee, they need to have that backed up by their subcontractor. Of course, that's not the business of the owner. The owner has one contract, but the EPC certainly needs to do that. And this is where it can be helpful to model out what we think is going to happen in a project, where if we're going to do Reg D, let's look at the signal, let's do sensitivity analysis and say, here are the various ways this could change. Here are the bounds of throughputs that could be experienced. Here's what the energy neutrality profile looks like now. Here's what it could look like. And now the EPC can go work with their vendor, the battery OEM, who's the expert on degradation, and quantify what kind of warranty can support those defined applications. And that's how it should work. But the contract's between two parties, so that's the OEM might not be in the room when you're in this dispute, so the EPC needs to be comfortable with it.
All right, so I'm just going to note we've got about, I think, 11 minutes left by my clock. So if anybody has questions, please be sure to get them in the chat box. I just wanted to move on to one more allocating risk issue from our case, which was drafting, I think maybe Tess probably has something to say about test plans for degradation warranties. But I also wanted to just go ahead and frame the issue on liquidated damages clauses. From a legal perspective, I think everybody has a sense that under state contract law, most states, your liquidated damages have to be related to your actual damages in some reasonable fashion. That can't be a penalty. And they generally are enforceable only when you can't actually calculate actual damages, or their actual damages are difficult to discern. In our case, I think we had some issues in the liquidated damages provisions that were designed to backstop revenue for the purchaser. But because this was a nascent application, the Reg D frequency regulation market, the way the LD provisions defined the required performance and calculated damages was not quite right on the money. So with that, I will turn it back to Tess.
Yeah, so as John alluded to, the LDs in this contract were extraordinarily complicated. And that was in part because there had been a contract revision. So there were multiple layers of LDs. There was an original LD, and then when some of the specifications changed in a contract amendment, another layer of LDs were put on top. But the end result was that there was an original intention to assign LDs based on various things that can go wrong, either lack of availability or uptime that was less than expected, which means being in the market for fewer hours than expected, or performance issues, which are again, if you're not able to follow a signal accurately or at your full sort of rated maximum capacity, then that will affect the revenue. So what you really want here is to take a look at what is the ultimate intended use of the energy storage system. It's to earn money in this particular market. Okay, what are the factors that determine how much money you're going to make? Well, it's the uptime and it's the accuracy in following the signal. And so then what you really want to do is try to define the simplest, crispest possible LDs that are associated with those parameters, because that links the LDs to the harm that is experienced. If the uptime isn't as expected, you can't be in the market as many hours as expected over the course of the lifetime or the course of a year, then you should have a very simple LD that is just dependent on that factor. If you can't follow the signal accurately, then you earn a lower performance score, and then you also earn less revenue than you would hope. And so again, you should have a crisp, simple, easily calculated LD that is associated with that parameter. And what we saw in this case is that there are, like I said, multiple layers of LDs that were a jumble. They really mixed up a lot of these different factors, and they did so in a way that had some pretty unintended consequences, significant unintended consequences, where because they were so complex and had so many, sort of unexpected outcomes, in part due to the market changing, they significantly overstated harm before the signal change. If you compare the lost revenue, which is an easily calculated objective number, to the LDs, they overstated revenue before the signal change and then understated revenue after the signal change. Accidentally and coincidentally. That's not how or why they were designed the way they were. But and I would say best practices are that you want to keep your LDs simple, and you want to associate them with easily measurable, quantifiable, and objective metrics, and you want to tie them directly to the harm that is experienced.
Yeah, I mean, it was interesting to see in this case how at least one LD measurement, seemed very reasonable in the context of other kinds of energy storage or battery applications. But with this Reg D signal, it was so fast moving that even when the system was responding well, it fell outside the LD parameters, even though it was earning pretty good revenue. And by the way, when Tess says something is easily calculated, that just means for her, not for the rest of us. It was critical to have such an able data analyst and mathematician when you're litigating one of these cases or putting together these kinds of liquidated damages provisions. So we've just got 5 minutes left. I just want to move a little bit. I don't know, Tess, did you want to mention just about degradation and test plans? I didn't want to forget that because it seems important to me.
Yeah, it is really important. It came up in this case, and we've also seen it come up in other cases where if you have that expected degradation curve in your warranty, and it really is a core part of any warranty, it's really important to also define a schedule at which energy capacity will be measured that both parties commit to and can expect, and also the test plan or the conditions under which the energy capacity is measured. In order to monitor energy capacity, it's not something that you can, it's not something that's immediately available. You have to pause and carry out a test plan and do a full charge discharge cycle. And so getting really crisp about exactly when and exactly under what conditions that test is carried out is important. In this case, that schedule wasn't followed. Or there wasn't a schedule that was defined. And so the energy capacity test that we had to work with happened well over a year into the project and several months after the signal change. And so there's just unavoidable ambiguity about how, it was clear that the throughput had significantly increased after the signal change. And it was unclear how much of that lower than expected energy capacity was due to that couple of months of operation and increased throughput, and how much had happened before the signal change. Because that measurement hadn't happened, there was just no way to disentangle those.
Yeah, we like to see that schedule and that procedure in the contract. So that's a critical contractual element for our perspective.
So in the last few minutes we have left, I just wanted to, I don't think we're really going to get to sort of to the enforcing obligations piece of this. So if anybody has questions about actually preparing for this litigation, I'm easy to find here at K&L Gates Portland office. But in terms of monitoring, once these contracts are in place, I think it is important to hear from Dan and Tess a little bit about current best practices. Because it was certainly an issue in our case that if you've got these liquidated damages provisions, you have degradation warranties, but the parties don't have access to the information required to actually do the calculations or monitor performance. What's the best way to do that now?
Yeah, it's very important that both parties have access to data that is relevant to assessing the commitments in the contract. So that's a simple statement, but that often means remote access for both parties, or a way that data can flow from one party to another without necessarily having remote access. And so we didn't have that happening in this project, and that was very problematic. In fact, neither party knew the signal change happened for quite a while after it happened. It's something that if you're standing there at the site, it's not directly observable unless you're looking at a more long-term power versus time curve. So throughput was a critical element of the contract, but neither party were tracking it in a very granular basis. That created a lot of problems. If they had been tracking that, I think we would have paused, figured out what changed, do an energy capacity measurement, and the entire trajectory of this dispute would have been different by having that piece of data, which wasn't available. So that setting up the conventions for that, securing and then making available to both parties the critical data elements is really important in the contractual phase.
Mm-hmm. And I would go even farther and say, the gold standard is really that if you have really important operational or performance or technical metrics that are part, that your warranty depends on, that any potential LDs depend on, ideally, you want those to be calculated at minimum regularly and ideally automatically. Maybe even have updating throughput calculation on the dashboard, something immediately available to all parties, so that there aren't any surprises. And the cases, in this particular case, because the performance score had been good, according to PJM, these systems were doing fairly well. Nobody had done the very, very cumbersome calculation of accuracy that was defined in the LD and realized that it was actually extremely different. And so when the LDs were actually calculated after the signal change and several years into the project, there were some big surprises. You should never have any surprises with LDs. All the parties involved in the contract should be aware of how the system is doing, how it's operating, and how it's performing as you go on a regular schedule. That's clearly defined.
All three of you, thank you so much. This has been fantastic. I know I've learned a ton. I'm hoping the audience has similarly enjoyed it. And I know you guys have to run. You've got another presentation sitting right behind this one. So I will hand things over to Grant to do a formal wrap up, and then everybody can get on their way. And if people have follow-up questions, feel free to reach out to us. We can route those questions and try to get your answers as quickly as possible. Grant?
Yeah, thanks, Eli. Just wanted to offer a big thanks to all of our esteemed panelists, Tess, Dan, and John. Thank you guys so much for delivering such an informative and interesting presentation. And also a big thanks to everyone in the audience for joining us today. And with that, this concludes today's program. We hope you enjoyed it. Have a great day, and we now disconnect.